Ashleigh Axios is a powerful voice in the world of design. Currently, she is the Chief Experience Officer at Ann Partners, a product design and development studio that uses a human-centered approach to solving problems that have social impact. She is also the president-elect of AIGA, the Professional Association for Design, and in the past, she was at Automatic, where she established the studio, Automatic's fully remote in-house creative agency for marketing communications and brand identity solutions. Maybe most notably, she also served as a creative director and digital strategist in the Obama administration. Ashleigh, welcome to the Culture Design Show.
Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute honor for me to have this conversation as a member of the design community, as well as a member of AIGA. Thank you so much for your leadership throughout these last years and continuing moving forward now that you're very soon going to act as president of the association.
Thanks. I'm so excited. I can't wait. We've been doing a lot, but it's thanks in part to members like yourself and the community that we're able to really shift that organization for the future. And I think everybody's gonna be excited about where we're heading next.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely excited. And yeah, you know, with everything that's been going on recently, we know that the conference was postponed till later in the year, and we were going to talk there, but through the power of technology, we're having this conversation here. And I just have been really fascinated with your career and your work and your leadership. And I thought maybe we could go back to the beginning of your career. I know that you went to RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. I'd love to just maybe hear how you started on this path in the world of design.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure my path is like the most interesting. I've heard some really interesting ones, but like I was always a creative kid. I think I, in a weird way, was lucky enough to be born into a creative family that didn't always just have the opportunity to utilize or to dive into that as a career option fully. So for example, my mom got accepted into, I believe it was Parsons, and she didn't end up going. She couldn't go, but she was really talented. So having a daughter that was always drawing and painting and creating things, every opportunity I had, I think she just knew to kind of push me and encourage and support me in that. And was much more open and flexible to most in me pursuing that. She actually had me job shadow with one of her first cousins. I don't even know what to call that level of family member, honestly. So I changed how I refer to it every other time. But he had worked at one of the first like minority-owned, minority-focused advertising agencies, Uniworld Group out of New York. And so she connected us when I was in middle school, and I had a chance to job shadow him doing really cool work for Pepsi and Burger King. And I knew that I wanted to, use design, use creativity for good, and ended up gravitating towards design as kind of an entry point or, an initial vehicle to kind of learn and embrace all aspects of design. And so that's what I majored in at RISD. I went to Rhode Island School of Design, as you mentioned, but I think I was the odd person out in that I knew graphic design was one component of what I wanted to do, but then again that it was just one aspect. And at the time there weren't really, at least that I was aware of, no service design for good, like conversations really happening. So that kind of got built up over time as I went, just reinforcing my understanding of design's capabilities. So that's, I don't know, the short version. I'm not going through my whole career there, but just kind of how I got to RISD in the first place, and kind of my thinking on design early on.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I can definitely resonate with, some of my careers. I started in architecture, but once I saw the power of design and its ability to transform different things in different ways, I definitely sought to apply those design principles to other areas. Speaking of which, you mentioned on your profile that you are an advocate for design's ability to break barriers and create positive social and cultural change. What does that mean for you?
So I think people can't, they can do things, but they're not going to gravitate towards big challenges, and they're not going to really jump into the hard, wicked problems that are out there unless they see folks like themselves, unless they see others doing that sort of work. So for me, being an advocate is in part demonstrating, telling my story, sharing the things that I've done. In particular, those areas where design is working on extremely complex problems and working with the direct hope impacts to really like change a community. And that community doesn't have to be huge. I tend to want to scale up to the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge possible. But sometimes it's changing one individual's life, right? And, you know, that's what design is for me. It's looking at things really, you know, honestly, realistically as they are today, seeing the problems, the weaknesses of them, and then really looking forward and seeing what's possible in an optimistic and visionary way and charting the path from where we are to where we want to go. And thinking about design like that, it seems so obvious to me that of course it can break barriers, of course it can create positive social and cultural change, right? You're taking something from an imperfect state where there are biases and problems, systemic problems or one-off problems, and moving them into a more streamlined way. And so that, you know, it seems obvious, but I think connecting that, getting people to really have those case studies, use cases, and examples of the ways it can be done in government and private sector, and the ways that it can happen on a local community level, and for people with different backgrounds and different resources who might not otherwise see themselves as like the biggest design champion on their own. That's kind of what I mean by being an advocate for it. It's partially about, even as a sometimes painful introvert, putting myself out there and sharing the stories that I know of, that I've seen, so that others can follow, challenge, and like, frankly, exceed them in the work that they do moving forward.
And you mentioned the area of government. You know, you've worked obviously with the Obama administration, and I've had the opportunity to do some work with in civic innovation at the local city hall level. And it's been interesting to hear how the methodologies and principles of design, what are some different ways that governments can embrace those things? And sometimes it's very hard. What are some of the things that you've seen in the past, in your experience, of how can we design those methodologies and those mindsets of design to help bring about governmental change?
The big thing, I think, is like embedding deeply. Sometimes designers, we want to make the change, but we want to do it as like a really distant consultant who's there are different ways to consult, right? But like that person who keeps an arm's length and just wants to like pitch the ideas and see others change it on the other side. That, in my experience, does not work very well in like government spaces, whether local or federal, right? They're complex, often bureaucracies. There are a lot of interdependencies, and you're dealing with individuals who are usually not in it for the pay, right? So they're working really hard. They're trying like their best to get something to work, and the failures aren't for lack of trying or lack of insight. It's usually more to do with a lack of funding or being stretched thin across you know, a myriad of a myriad of priorities and issues that they're working on. So I think designers can really teach the most by like embedding, working directly, going really close with the partners and clients internal within government, and utilizing the language that they use.
Yes. Yeah, that's so important.
Not trying to teach them like design thinking terminology,
Right, yeah.
and getting them to get their like, you know, their free PhD in design. But applying all the things that we know from our design educations and from being design practitioners directly into the work, and helping them by drawing parallels to their policy work, their technology work, their, you know, civic coordination, drawing the parallels to the work that they do consistently and working within the processes and the restraints that they have. I actually think that designers thrive in that, right? We're used to constraints. We're used to working cross-functionally. We rely on it, right? Not some designers can do all of the writing and coding, and you know, there's that like 10x joke that was going around for the longest time on social media. Like there are a few designers that could do like just about everything, but most of us rely and we work best when we're actually working deeply in conjunction with subject matter experts in different disciplines, and trusting them and adapting to their language and their resources. And I think in the ways that they work. And I think that's a chameleon-like skill that we have that enables us to go into some really complex bureaucracies and change the way that the whole group thinks and works to be more agile, fluid, modern, and to get changes done in steady intervals, again, from that like messy, imperfect today to that imagined future that for the most part, everybody tends to be on board with in government and just not know necessarily how to get there and need a little extra support to get there.
Yeah, I think that's something that I've seen when we are trying to embrace some culture of design-led thinking. I think many times we who are practitioners or creatives or, you know, so craftspeople in the world of design, I know at least in architecture, I came out of architectural school with such a different lexicon. I mean, I was using words that were very, very well embraced in our circle of thinking.
Totally,
but people were just thinking like, oh my gosh, what language are you talking about? Like, I don't understand juxtaposition and, you know, all these different words that we were using, and they were looking at us like we were from a different world. And I think that those of us who are also in the world of design in general, you know, whether we're talking about design thinking or just design principles about branding and things like that, I think we can definitely nerd out and actually shut people off by using these words. And I think your point about embracing the existing language, but maybe adapting it in a different way. And rather than talking about harping on methodology, talk about desired outcomes. And so that's something that I've been thinking about a lot as well.
Yeah, it's great. And I think a lot of that language can change, right? If you really know it well, you can find 10 other ways to say the same thing. And that only reinforces our skills as designers. It doesn't, you know, I think some are afraid that they're dumbing themselves down or something. Like, no, you're even sharper if you can go in and you have the flexibility to explain something to a technologist, a policymaker, you know, an accessibility advocate, and you can adapt your language and you can explain the same thing to different audiences using totally different terms. That's like genius level. You're like upping your game and going to be able to succeed in almost any environment. So it's a great skill to have, but it does take a while to practice, and it takes being really uncomfortable because a lot of the times you're not going to know what works. You just have to try it in real time with people, and if it doesn't click, try it in other terms, and you're on the spot. It's a little bit more improvisational.
Well, speaking to that new skill of upping your game, I was talking to a creative director at a large firm in the Silicon Valley, and she was saying, that the expectations of their clients are beginning to change. And
Yeah.
even some of the expectations within the firm, meaning the talent, they're changing as well. And so some of these clients are saying, hey, we were fine before with you being the creative, you doing the work for us, but
Mm-hmm.
now we want you to do the work with us. And
Mm-hmm.
so she was mentioning that there is this triple threat design leader, that the need for that is starting to emerge. And that is one who is not only the creative or the subject matter expert, and then two, being the co-creative, which is being almost like a facilitator to
Mm-hmm.
co-create with the clients, but then also as a coach, because once the project needs to be implemented, the creative can only be there for a short while, but the ability to coach clients as well as to coach employees. What are your thoughts about that? Whether expectations are changing, and if so, are they requiring a new set of skills?
That's great. I mean, I love that framework. I'd say that that resonates really strongly with me and what I've seen. I do think that there are those that have always done that, but it
Mm-hmm.
is
Sure.
becoming much more an expectation on the client side that, um, at the completion of services, they'll know how to, almost like you would for a technology that's implemented, they'll know how to maintain something and carry it forward. And so that is, I think, starting to flow into their skill sets and the expectations for designers overall and the skills that get offered. Um, as far as like how designers now adapt and prepare for that sort of change, um, you know, I'm of the mindset that the only way you do is just putting yourself out there and doing it. It's like,
Yeah, learn by doing.
yeah, taking the risk and, you know, not everybody can, some can. And if you find a great program that'll teach you how to be a facilitator and a coach, then like more power to you. But right now there aren't a whole lot of those. And so uh, for a designer that's looking to get into it, I'd say the best way is to just start teaching others,
Right.
working with friends and peers, and getting feedback along the way.
Well, in regards to even just upskilling and learning new skills and things like that, a lot of agencies out there are probably pretty small and may not necessarily have a huge L&D budget, like some of the
Right.
larger firms. What are some ways that you think that design leaders at different scales, because I think you in your talk last year at the conference, you talked about scaling culture. What are some ways that we can begin to scale abilities, scale culture within our firms, no matter what the size of our firm is?
Absolutely. I think, there's working on design at a tactical level, there's working on solutions at a system level. And I'd say if you're then working on focused projects as a really small team, as an individual freelancer, that might be the first step that I would encourage is, um, bridging into systems thinking. If you offer a one-off instruction to a client on how to do something, and you want to be better at facilitating, and you want to be better at teaching to larger groups, put that together as a system and offer it on your site. Start with a Medium post, break it down. You can put it behind a paywall if you need it to support your
Mhm.
company moving forward. But to look at having that offering for more than that individual audience, and pushing for collaboration in both the creation of the solution and the overall um, consumption of it. I feel like I'm getting slightly off of what your question
That's
was,
that's
though,
okay.
Stephen.
And just so you know, I'll be
Yeah.
editing this
Oh, sure.
just to make sure that if we have any
As
gaps,
tight as
yeah,
possible. Yeah.
yeah. So no problem. If you need to even like stop and start at any point, just let me know. Um, so before COVID-19 hit our world, I would
Yeah.
imagine that you had a vision, you have a vision of where the design community is today and where it's going and what we need to equip ourselves in order to get there. So I want to maybe ask you that first. Before this all happened, what were some of your thoughts about the future of the design community?
That's a great question. I'll kind of back up a step and just kind of share where my own transition was, because it relates to it. So,
Yeah.
in working in the Obama White House, I was like on site so many hours every single week, working really collaboratively with writers, developers, policymakers. But I was working in this physical building away from the sunlight, like way too frequently. And that's not how most folks work, but it felt like this deep dive into this like traditional 20th century work scenario where I wasn't seeing my family that much. There was tension between work and personal life in a really high extreme. And when I was considering what I wanted to do after I left the White House in 2016, it wasn't on my radar. Somebody put it on my radar, like how many companies were going remote, or even fully distributed, and some of the benefits that came with that. And so I was able to make the jump to Automatic, which you mentioned. They're actually a fully distributed company, with folks across the US speaking more than like 74 languages, I think it is. Wow. And really kind of functioning, thinking in this global context too, because they're creating WordPress.com, Jetpack, these products. Like WordPress powers for like 36% of the internet, right? So you're working across language and culture, and people are just coming to the space with totally different contexts and expectations. And so I was really excited to start there, to move from like selfishly in some ways, but like being really traditional on site somewhere, to something where I could work from home. I could spend more time directly with family and loved ones. I had flexible hours because we're a global company, and I could take a break in the middle of the day. I could prioritize working when I and more expedient and high functioning, as opposed to, just the, I'm joking, but like when the man says you gotta work.
Yeah, the 9 to 5, what the man says, if not 9 to 9, whatever.
Yeah. So, that was a huge and really beneficial change for me. And of course, that takes a little bit adapting and getting used to. But through that, I was able to build an internal team, the studio that you mentioned, working across time zones from Poland to the West Coast US, and collaborating with team members who are in Australia and India, et cetera, on different projects, and do so in a way that was respectful and thoughtful, and gave people a chance to prioritize what matters to them in their life and their work, and have a sense of fulfillment, but also balance. And so I was lucky because, Automatic's not perfect internal culture, and it's a tech company, and there are problems, I think, with any US tech company these days. But I was able to see like all these glimmers of like hope and this possibility that I think if I hadn't been exposed to Automatic, I just would have gone with the status quo, not even knowing that I was just so used to the expectation that I was going to be like in office working 9 to 5 hours. And we're creative, so it's never just 9 to 5, but at least those 9 to 5 hours. And so coming out of all of that, and figuring out what I was going to do post Automatic, it was really a priority to me to keep pushing in this like distributed workforce sense. I love that I could have employees who live anywhere, who don't feel like they have to move into a city center in order to work with us, that we can recruit some of the best talent across the board. Again, that they get all of those benefits of good pay. If something changes in their lives, there's some flexibility too, with that kind of remote work setup. So, say I'm living in DC and it's very expensive, but it's going to be a little bit at least before we get, universal health care, whatever in the US, somebody gets sick in my family, I've got the flexibility to possibly move somewhere that's less expensive and keep the job that I have today to reduce costs. So it just provides more family options for prioritizing things based on need. So I wanted to keep all of that embedded. And so I'd say that's already, this is a really long answer to your question, but already like kind of where my mind is at in this like future of not just work, but like education and really moving into a more 21st century way of like living and growing professionally. There were conversations when I was in the Obama White House about MOOCs, these like massive open online courses that were like the early thinking on education in this distributed fashion. And that's like had fits and stops and like certainly has not been solved for. And I think in part because a lot of things we just don't prioritize, not even us as a design culture, but when our broader culture doesn't prioritize it, it makes it difficult. So I'm trying not to go into policy rabbit hole, but like we had initiatives and efforts in the Obama White House to focus on making sure people had, especially schools and more remote locations, but access to like really strong digital broadband internet.
Yeah.
Because it's really hard to get remote education or a remote job if you don't even have the basic like signal or connectivity to support that. And that had support and then no support in Congress, and just didn't have that priority at this like broader level within, I'm being US centric here for now, but within the US economy and US political space to get the support it needed to really go as far as it could have. And now I think we're feeling that now in this like time of crisis.
Yeah, for sure.
Because suddenly students are forced to work from home. Hundreds of thousands of people are, I don't know the total numbers right now, but I'm pretty sure a good number are being forced to work from home, or at least everybody's being encouraged to work from home. And the tools and the infrastructure isn't totally in place to support that.
Yeah, I know that my sons, they're 11 or 14 here in the city of Long Beach, California, and we're one of the largest districts here in California. But they were, schools closed 2 weeks ago, and the kids were finally given access to Chromebooks, at least for those across the city. But there was also this question of access to Wi-Fi. They mentioned that 12% of our students don't have access to Wi-Fi. So that digital equity has been a really large conversation here in the city anyways, outside of even the students. But this whole period of basically working from home, learning from home, whatever the case may be, has exposed some of our inefficiencies or inadequacies in our systems that we maybe weren't quite as ready as we thought we were. And it seems to me that your experience at Automatic definitely prepared you maybe for, and gave you a perspective of what the future may look like, and you brought that into and partners. So the next question is, how do you think this experience of COVID-19, of working from home, is going to change the design community from here on out? Will we ever go back to the way it was completely, or will there be some change as the rubber band snaps back?
I think there are still a lot of questions about how we respond in the coming weeks that will help determine that. Because if you're forced into having to work from home and it's a terrible, terrible experience for you, right? Because you've got no training, you're like working out of your kitchen, and there are like 10 other people in your house, and like all of these things that people are dealing with now. And there's no steady process to go to work through the problems on solutions. And if you never get the training and the support and start to see that situation improve, even if we start to fix the digital infrastructure and, we solve the access to computer problems, and workplaces now implement new policies saying everybody can work from home, even though they're really against it. So many of them were really against it before for kind of unknown reasons. Your employee or student reaction is probably going to be a bit of a trauma reaction of like, no, I don't want to work from home. Like, okay, it works, but it's not for me, right? Because, you didn't have the support. And on top of that, it's just a generally hard emotional time for us across the US. Like, we're thinking about the health and safety of people, hopefully, right? But, and that's like an additional layer of, like adding tiredness and stress to people's daily routines. So I think if we're not careful in how we support one another and deal with things right now, we might have a really hard negative backlash to working remotely, or creating that sort of flexibility, and people might not be open to it and might totally miss all the benefits, right? Because
that is
especially if you're stuck in your house, you're not seeing the benefits of being able to like spend more time with your kid. You're like, oh my God, I need support from my kid.
For sure. That's an interesting perspective. I guess the optimist in me has only thought of what are the beautiful things that can come out of this, but I hadn't thought about it like, okay, what is the potential backlash of saying, no, that experience was so horrible, whether it was my physical environment or my access to technology or the ability or inability to shut off the distractions within the home, was 0% openness to working from home moving forward. I hadn't thought about that. That's an interesting perspective, though, that could come out of this. Because I know my kids, again, 11 and 14, they're such digital natives that they've actually not missed a beat. It's just really interesting how different generations of people can respond. But even to my, my boomer parents and parents-in-law, they've embraced this. It's been difficult, and I've got my dad with we're trying to do a FaceTime call, and he's got just he's only his eyes above that are on the screen, and so it's just funny to hear and see different people respond to this environment.
I think like there's a lot that could come out of it, and I would encourage people on the positive side. I would encourage people who have worked successfully in a remote fashion before and have seen the benefits to help. Not all of them apply right now. Obviously, if you're quarantined in your house, you're not going to get some of the benefits, but to help break those down and not in a preachy way, but like provide resources and support those who are thrown into it really hard right now. And I think that'll make a pretty big difference. But it's also about allowing people a chance to opt in, because I have seen a lot of tech companies being like, well, let me tell you why this is the best. And I'm like, I think you're not reading the room.
That's true. Reading the room. Speaking to that, I know that we mentioned before that sometimes there are a lot of leaders that are well versed in maybe this triple threat way of doing things. But there are also, like, I come from the architectural world, and I learned that even in that field, there's a lot of people who are very task oriented, and hey, I just need to figure out what is the brief, what is the requirements of the project, and I'm just gonna put my head down and just do the work. But not being able to read the room. How important is it to read the room, especially now that we're kind of have this digital interface, at least for the foreseeable future? How important is that, and how can we develop those skills?
That's a great question. I mean, I think we're human, and so we're inherently social, and we can't turn that off. And so we've got to be really intentional, especially when we're using digital means to communicate with one another, especially when it's, text-based communication over Slack or email or social media to ensure that we're thinking about tone and that we're clear how somebody's doing first. I'm guilty, frankly, of
I'm so
jumping
guilty.
in Monday morning on Slack and being like, hey, have you done X? And like, if that wouldn't be my first interaction if I ran into a coworker in the hallway in a physical office, right? I would say, hey, how was your weekend? How are you? Like,
Yeah.
we'd have a little bit of a human exchange. I'd maybe read the fact that they look a little tired and like, you know, approach them slightly different than if they were looking really peppy and like going full force. And so I think that's stuff that we have to be a little bit more thoughtful when we're using digital means of connecting with one another, because it gets lost more easily. And I think that's where hopefully folks aren't experiencing this too much, but there's some backlash of like, person meant this, the tone was read as something entirely different, and now we're having this, you know, tense discussion with one another because we just misaligned on tone and how that person was doing.
Yeah.
I also like encourage every leader in this time, whether they're managing people or not, to just like encourage over communication rather than like under communicating. It's hard to read the room if the room is pretty silent, especially online. So practices like stand-ups and really being vulnerable as a leader yourself can allow other people to be a little bit more vulnerable, because we're not going to communicate well if nobody's comfortable saying like, wow, I'm having a really shitty day. And I'm having a hard time even focusing today. I'm just feeling it. I'm more upset. And like, that's a huge part of how somebody shows up in the workplace. That says a lot about what they need from their coworkers and how much should be on their plate. And any manager or just peer wants to know and wants to support, but we can't do that unless we're a little bit vulnerable and let ourselves go there. So I think part of it is about like being the example for that, so that others can follow and feel like it's a safe environment to bring themselves a little bit more fully.
Yeah, I have a sense that in this time, there's probably an even greater need for empathy and compassion, because I think we're all experiencing this new normal, at least for the next little bit. And, you know, for those that can adequately share, you know, their struggles, their stress, their anxiety, or even, you know, just being mad at themselves for not being as productive as they'd want to be. I think that vulnerability is so important, even more so in today's climate. That's my guess.
I totally agree. I think it takes practice, and it's uncomfortable, but it's also valuable for getting the good work done. And I know, I feel like I have a better time with my coworkers and my friends alike too, when we're just real with one another. We let ourselves get a bit more vulnerable.
You know, it almost appears to me like, you know, our interface right now is through this screen. So we have this window, and that we're much more intentional with conversations, with whether we're in meetings or with friends or family. I think sometimes even Slack. So I think I don't know if you've experienced it, but it seems to me like even as we're adapting to this new technology as our sole means of communication, it seems like we have to be extra intentional in order to make this work. But the extra intentionality also is extra exhausting. Have you found that to be true?
Yeah, like people can overthink things too easily as well. And I think that might be what you're communicating there, right? Where like, I want to say something to my coworker, but I also know people are tense right now. And so I'm going to spend a whole 5 minutes on this sentence trying to think through like, what is the best way to phrase it? And then you're more exhausted, and it's still less clear on how it's going to be read by them, right? Because it's totally subjective. I think that is a bit of a risk, and I've seen some individuals and companies do a really good job of experimenting to break that up. And our team has been doing some virtual kind of happy hours with one another.
Yeah.
And that's one way to remind them that Zoom doesn't mean presentation, or
Yeah.
that this like technology doesn't have to, suddenly be synonymous for like business casual or something like that.
Yeah.
We can use it to share socially and just talk about what's going on in our lives, or cheers one another, celebrate a moment. And that sort of thing, I think, helps break it down a little bit and get us out of the rut of, just like one way of thinking about these pieces. But even that takes work. So somebody's got to do the work to bridge the gap, encourage people to share new ideas, like offer it up as like a design challenge internally within the company culture, within the group culture, to give people the space and freedom, flexibility to like challenge the notions of how the tools are used.
Right. We mentioned culture there, and the name of the podcast is the Culture Design Show, and we kind of look at it in a couple of ways. One is the culture of design, and then the reverse of that, it's the design of culture. When you think of culture of design, what comes to mind for you?
Honestly, some negative things like the, colonization of design, and thoughts on like who gets to make the canon, the design canon, who gets to invent who the top people are, or decide who gets celebrated, which is historically not so great. And also some things like hustle culture, right? Has for a really long time been really embedded in design culture. And then some more positive things, like I think design culture, there are embedded things like critique and continual evolution and change, which are really positive. And there are other notions that I would say are pretty deeply embedded and more inherently positive as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm on board with you in terms of all the beautiful aspects, beautiful people, brilliantly, brilliant thinkers, brilliant crafts people in terms of what they do. Being the strategist that I am, I tend to look for problems in order to try to solve them. And so I tend to look at what are the things that we can improve. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is there are principles and methodologies that many times we will use in terms of when we're client facing, in terms of empathy, in terms of emotional intelligence. And I think that sometimes though, we fail to implement those in our own teams. Is that something that you've seen? And if so, how can we resolve that in terms of practicing what we're preaching?
Well, one is thinking, if you're a business owner, like I'm able to be right now, like having that perspective that if you're offering something as a service externally, making sure that you have the same thought internally. So I'm the chief experience officer, which we talked about at And Partners. We're a really small company, so it's like not as fancy as it sounds. But for where we are right now as a company in size and how we're thinking about it, that broaches what I think a lot of people think about with experience, which is customer experience and client experience, that external. But we're also very intentional to make sure that under my purview is employee experience. And that is baked in. It is as important that the recruiting and onboarding, that the resources, the tools, that our codes of conduct are as thoughtful internally as they are for when we're doing workshops and engaging with clients and building tools and products for end customers externally. So I think like foundationally, that's really important, because there has to be somebody who's ultimately accountable. And then everybody can have a sense of shared responsibility in helping make that happen and provide feedback. But like we used to advocate for design to get a seat at the head of the table, and still a lot of those conversations happening. Um, if it's not represented at the top, it's probably not that valued.
Yeah.
And so making sure that there's somebody who's ultimately accountable, who's going to help make sure that there's growth over time, over every quarter, and that's being thought of consistently, as consistently as you're thinking about those external experiences. That's pretty essential, I'd say. And then I think even for the individual designer somewhere, it's like, well, I can't change my company structure, so I don't know what that does for me, Ashleigh.
Right.
I think some big things for building internal culture are, when you're applying to a job, setting the expectation, just like we do it as individuals and managing expectations with clients. Like, say as early on as possible, like, this is important to me. I'm going to be providing feedback on it because I care about the culture that I'm in, and then do it. Like, just give that feedback, share the areas that you believe there's room for improvement. And then some of the best internal projects, just as an individual contributor, that I had a chance to do were just things that I pitched on my own. So like, you might pitch an external project. I think most designers would be pleasantly surprised by just how receptive large and small companies are to a designer being like, hey, I want to take 2 hours this week to collaborate with HR on this like experience problem they have. That like I think could be improved really quickly, and it'll make our onboarding experience or whatever it is a whole lot better for everybody. That's huge. Yeah, why not? That's a service, that's an offering. Sometimes it's a direct product that can be worked on. So part of it is just, I think, looking for those opportunities and feeling like, while you might have been hired for the more client-facing work, there's still a chance for you to kind of pitch and get involved and do things that directly design or improve the internal processes.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think that's the flip side of my original question is, well, the original question was more about culture of design. And I think the design of culture, using those design principles and methodologies to actually design the culture of the organization. And I love what you're citing, those examples of people who are maybe have to start with a culture of one, like just by themselves, and then hopefully gain 2 or 3 other recruits within their team or their team leader. Although I have had some conversations with, say, talent leaders at creative firms who have said, okay, we have different generations in our firm. We have the, folks that are of the boomer generation, the Gen X, and the millennials. And there's this struggle because we're moving towards a new way that design culture needs to look like moving forward. But then maybe the leaders of that firm have said, hey, we've gotten success because of the way we've done it before, but it's causing, in some cases, some problems because maybe there has been that very charismatic single leader who has been the architect of that culture in the past. Do you think that there is some need for leaders, rather than to be architects of culture, but to be facilitators of culture?
Yeah, and I think everybody also needs to take on a growth mindset. Like, if you're not growing and evolving over time, then you've got to accept that some of your ideas and ways of working are going to become outdated. That's the same if you're, designing a PDF booklet, right? Like, the tools you use over time have changed on that, even just the past 10 years, as it is for somebody who's a leader at the very top of an organization. And so, similarly, internally, when building culture, that person who's ultimately responsible needs to listen to their users, like the people who are part of the culture, and really take in the feedback and look to like adjust and change methodologies and adjust principles like over time. Usually like the values aren't the things that need to change. And so that is where I think the leader should hold firm and fast, and maybe, you know, designers can help them lock in on those. Oh, you think maybe it's that we need to work really long hours and have hustle culture because that's what you did for so many years. Mm-hmm. But what I'm hearing and understanding in all that is that you value like hard work and like excellence in results, and right. Like that, those values probably shouldn't change, but like how you get there can totally change and should totally change over time. Yeah.
It's that we are in alignment in terms of the desired outcomes, and we have an idea of what that looks like. We both agree, but if you would allow us to determine for ourselves what's the best way to get there. I mean, that was one lesson I had to learn even in architecture. And that is, we would, you know, draw our plans out and then we would give them over to the contractors, but we could actually not tell the contractors the ways and means in which they actually executed. We just needed to make sure that the outcome was exactly what we wanted. And so it was an interesting dynamic that I think that's what was so wonderful about co-creation and cultures. That mix of co-creation and culture is the leaders can say, hey, this is where we want to go in terms of direction, but I need you to come on board to help me determine what that looks like. It's almost like adding flesh to the spirit of those values. And I think that's something that's really powerful.
I love that. I completely agree. And I would even say that I think culture is much more democratic than we like to give it credit for. It happens organically, it changes over time. And so sometimes, you know, individuals think that they're setting the culture because they're in a position of power. But if you're 1 in 800 or whatever it is, like you could just be the rotten apple in the culture that's really thriving and beautiful because you're outnumbered. Everybody's their own entity. Together, they're creating this really vibrant thing that's changing over time. So like controlling cultures like does not work well, I think, on any level. Like it's just much more organic and free form, like language, like art, like music art. These are things that we make together. Our tastes change over time. The ways that like subcultures connect with one another will adapt things. So in a workplace environment, that's like you have somebody coming in, but they worked in a technology company or in-house in a corporate environment or in a small design studio. Those are all like, you get the influences of all these other subcultures that will change the culture that you're in over time and help adapt it. So I think that's a beautiful thing, but it is like, you know, designers, we do like to control things.
Control, prescribe, determine, for sure. I mean, that was actually part of I did some graduate work at Parsons for strategic design management, and my thesis was around transforming creative cultures. And I thought that maybe because of my own background in creative agencies, that there was a special nuance about creative cultures, and there might be in some cases, but it's actually a very human thing. It's a very human centered problem, if you will, and thing to focus on. We could talk on culture all day, but we are at the end of our time. Folks, we've been talking to Ashleigh Axios. And Ashleigh, if someone wants to reach out to you, folks that don't already know you and see you all over the internet, where can people find you?
You can find me at ashleighaxios.com. That's ASHLEIGHAXIOS.com. And there's a contact form, a way to reach out to me directly there, or you can find me on Twitter or, you know, wherever I'm around.
All right, Ashleigh, thank you so much. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.